One way of thinking about this is just as a tax, and therefore it's the biggest tax hike that we've seen in our lifetimes, with some percentage of GDP, maybe 2, maybe 1, but a big tax hike on consumers of imported goods.
Why influential financial historian Neil Ferguson calls Trump's tariff policies a virus on the world economy.
Funding provided by Clearbridge Investments, the Fairholme Foundation, First Eagle Investments, Bill Miller, Baird, Strategas Asset Management, Research Affiliates, Royce Investment Partners, Seafarer Capital Partners, and Women Investing in Security and Education.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Wealth Track. I'm Consuelo Mack. The evidence is everywhere. No matter what the ultimate shape of President Trump's tariff policies take, the flow of goods around the world is slowing, and at some point the prices of goods will rise. That is what large and widespread hikes in tariffs do. Even Trump's baseline 10% across-the-board tariffs represent a huge increase from last year, when the average rate of U.S. tariffs was a mere 2.5%. In a recent essay for The Times, this week's guest equated these Trump tariff hikes to COVID-19, a new virus that could devastate the world economy. He is Neil Ferguson, now Sir Neil, having been knighted in 2024 by King Charles for his contributions to literature. Ferguson is one of the world's leading historians. A senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard, Ferguson is the author of numerous articles and a regular columnist for the Free Press. He is also the author of 16 books, many of them bestsellers. Among them, The Ascent of Money, A Financial History of the World, now in its updated 10th edition, which he produced as an award-winning PBS series. And his most recent book, Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe, which analyzes how societies have reacted to crises over the centuries, including how governments handled the COVID-19 pandemic. Over a decade ago, Ferguson branched out into the investment arena as founder and managing director of Greenmantle, an advisory firm offering historical perspective and research services to a select group of clients, including many top hedge fund and investment firms. I began our conversation, which will be the first of 2 wide-ranging interviews, with this question. Why was he calling Trump's tariff policies a new global virus with potentially devastating economic consequences?
When I compared President Trump's reciprocal tariffs that he announced on April 2nd, Liberation Day, with COVID-19, I wasn't being disparaging. I was just noting that it was a comparable shock to global supply chains. If you think back 5 years, one of the effects of COVID was to cause a breakdown in international trade and, of course, also in international travel. If you look at the immediate aftermath of the Liberation Day announcements, you saw comparable declines in passenger traffic to the United States from abroad, especially from Canada, but not only from Canada, from Europe too. If you look at the effect of Trump's tariffs, not only the reciprocal tariffs, but the tariffs he'd already imposed on China, there's been a really quite drastic decline in Chinese exports to the United States. Now, unlike COVID-19, which it was impossible to stop spreading, and which there was no vaccine against until the very end of 2020, President Trump can dial back, and has dialed back, his tariffs since April 2nd. In fact, on April 9th, just a week after he announced them, he introduced a 90-day pause in response to the kind of financial shock that he had caused. So the analogy isn't exactly the same, because we've already seen a significant reduction in the tariffs that he announced, or at least a postponement in the tariffs that he announced on April 2nd. But at the moment he announced those reciprocal tariffs, the world economy was facing a shock as big as that which COVID unleashed 5 years ago. But what is interesting is that in each case you're administering what economists like to call a supply-side shock that very suddenly changes everything that is happening in the world economy and forces businesses everywhere to alter their plans. And it also has an impact on consumers because the disruption to supply chains will manifest itself in shortages or higher prices or some combination of the two. So I don't want to overdo this. I think it's now clear that the shock is less than the COVID shock, but that's because President Trump has deferred or reduced the tariffs that he initially announced.
Regardless of that, and we're talking now on May 9th, so who knows what's going to happen, but nonetheless, it appears from the deals that the president has worked out, most recently with the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, that the 10% baseline tariff across the board is going to be kept intact. The U.S. average import tariff just last year was 2.5%. So that is an enormous increase. So let's say that that's just as a baseline. What are the implications and the ramifications of that from an economic point of view?
Well, it amounts to turning the clock of economic history back. For most of our lifetimes, the direction of travel was for average US tariffs to decline. The United States was a protectionist country for most of its history up until the Second World War, and after that the US embarked on a policy of trade liberalization which was bipartisan and took the average tariff rate down below 2% by the time of the global financial crisis. President Trump's first term involved tariffs, but the increases were significantly less than the ones that he's now talking about. So let's assume, as I think a lot of people in markets currently assume, that when all is said and done, many, if not most, of the reciprocal tariffs will be negotiated away. And we'll end up in a world where the US charges a 10% tariff on just about all its imports, and it probably charges a higher tariff on Chinese imports because it's pretty clear that the administration's drawing a distinction between its friends and allies on one side and China. And so we'll end up in a world in which the average tariff rate is probably around 10 times what it was last year, maybe a bit less. That's a pretty big change in American trade policy. That takes us back perhaps to the period before World War II. Certainly it takes us back to before I was born in terms of the level of protection. What's the consequence? Well, part of it depends on who pays. Most economists expect that US consumers will absorb a pretty big part of the increased cost. And so one way of thinking about this is just as a tax. And therefore it's the biggest tax hike that we've seen in our lifetimes, with some percentage of GDP, maybe 2, maybe 1, but a big tax hike on consumers of imported goods. I imagine some of the costs will be absorbed by the companies doing the importing who don't want to price themselves out of the US market, and some may be absorbed by the exporters abroad. President Trump says it's all going to be paid by the foreign exporters, and that's just not borne out by what happened last time. So we enter a world in which things jump in price, particularly things imported from China, but it's a one-off shock to the price level. It doesn't necessarily turn into persistent inflation, but it means for a period we'll see prices rising. Some people think you could see an inflation rate that goes up from 2 point something to 4 point something, but you'll be told, and I expect to be hearing, that it's transitory. Remember that word? It was a popular word back in 2022 too. Anyway, so there's an inflation effect. But I think the most interesting question, Consuelo, is really how do the supply chains of the world reconfigure themselves? You have to think of the global economy as this incredibly complex network of supply chains in which products like an iPhone, for example, in fact consist of components and processes from multiple countries. China's only one of them. The lesson of the first Trump term was that if you went after China and made it more expensive to buy stuff from China, the same goods just arrived in the United States via third countries, Vietnam, Mexico. And this will be a problem for President Trump if he really wants to decouple the US from the Chinese economy, because we still import a lot of stuff that originates in China. In some areas, China is the dominant source of US import. So I think the real question is, how quickly do the supply chains reconfigure themselves? And is the Trump administration going to go after things that originated in China, even if they appear to be imports from Mexico? Rules of origin are going to become a talking point, and it's going to turn out to be quite difficult to establish.
How much is this going to hurt China, do you think? And if you were to assess the position of these two, major adversaries, China and the U.S., the long game, who stands the better chance of lasting and winning this trade war?
Well, there are two separate questions, Consuelo. The first one, who's hurting more? And the answer has to be China, because the United States is less reliant on imports than most economies. It's a pretty large self-contained economy. And China's more reliant on exports relative to its gross domestic product. But the second question is, who is more politically sensitive to economic pain? And you don't need me to point out that one of these players is a democracy, has things like midterm elections to think about next year, and the other is not. And Xi Jinping has already demonstrated during COVID that he can inflict a lot of social and economic pain on the Chinese people. And it was a very long lockdown, the longest and tightest lockdown in the world that he was able to impose. And that, I think, is the key here. I have no doubt that there are meaningful economic consequences playing out in China, and there may even be some social unrest. But the Chinese Communist Party has got an iron grip over the population through systems of digital and other surveillance. It is very difficult indeed to engage in any kind of protest in China without very quickly being clamped down on. Whereas the United States, and this I think is the critical issue, is now on track for an economy that will grow more slowly, may even enter recession, and there's going to be some increase in inflation. So these things are going to have political consequences, and it won't be long before it shows up in the price data, and then it's going to show up in the labor market data, and then it's going to show up in the polls, and then there are going to be some very concerned Republicans on the Hill wondering when the midterms come around, are we going to get a shellacking?
So even if President Trump retreats, as we've seen him do from the most draconian policies that he announced on Liberation Day in April, there is still damage being done by this rapid and large increase in tariffs. One of the phrases that you used was, it's going to cascade through the economy.
Right.
So what do you think as far as the damage that is already baked in the system, and that there's not really anything that we can do to reverse it?
So whatever happens, there will be a persistent uncertainty about US trade policy for some months to come, and that's going to impact behavior. We can already see it in the survey data. Consumers are concerned, businesses are concerned, confidence is down. It's going to then translate into investment decisions getting postponed, purchase decisions getting postponed. So I think we're looking at something a bit reminiscent of 2006, 7, 8. Do you remember, I think you and I talked about it at the time, the slow way in which the subprime mortgage resets of early 2007 fed into the financial system and did not produce the real breakdown of the financial crisis until September 2008. And that kind of chain reaction is typical in a large, complex economy. This is a different shock. I don't think it has quite such severe financial implications, but nevertheless, you should expect the trade policy uncertainty that President Trump unleashed on April 2nd to have enduring macroeconomic effects, feeding through into a slowdown, if not a recession, whatever he does from now on. You can't turn off this chain reaction. It's underway. And the only question is, what's the magnitude? How much do prices go up? And more importantly, how much does growth decline? I think it's reasonable base case to expect our growth rate to be down around 1% by the later part of the year. But as I said, there's a probability of recession which is substantially higher, even than we talked about 2 years ago. And you'll remember, economists thought there was going to be a recession in 2023.
The Fed hiked.
And it didn't happen. And the economists have the problem of the boy who cried wolf right now. Everybody who's talking about a recession is kind of being dismissed. And I think a lot of investors are in the kind of it's going to be fine mode. But I remember 2007, the same mentality was there in the stock market. And I think people who say to me, well, look at the stock market, it's rallied somewhat since April 2nd. Yeah, sure. But I mean, the stock market is not a profit. It does not have a foresight into all that's going to happen. That's an illusion. And as there's still uncertainty around so much that we're discussing, it's perfectly possible that we'll get a major correction in any time between now and the end of the summer. There's a lot of bad news that can still materialize that currently isn't priced in.
As far as the tariff policy in general, the reasons that Trump certainly has given is protectionism for the home industry, and they're great revenue producers, and and also kind of to level the playing field in trade. Have tariffs ever worked historically to accomplish those goals?
Well, tariffs are a very old form of taxation that goes way back, and because it's one of the easiest ways that you can tax economic activity, to levy duties at ports where goods arrive. So this is not novel. In fact, it's a throwback. The United States federal government relied heavily on tariffs as a source of revenue from its very inception right the way through the 19th century and into the 1930s. And so
until the income tax came in, right? And then we had another source of revenues, right?
So income tax came in, and the federal government changed in its scale very significantly with the advent of programs like Social Security and later Medicare. But President Trump is nostalgic for a time when tariffs were a major source of revenue, and that's one of the ways in which he sold tariffs on the campaign trail. But these other uses are relevant too. They're being asked to provide revenue in the hundreds of billions of dollars, not an unimportant role given the size of the federal deficit and the fact that tax cuts are likely to be enacted by Congress. They're being asked to be a negotiating lever. But of course, if you're using them as a negotiating lever aiming to get to freer trade, then they're not going to be around to be a source of revenue for long. So it's got to be one or the other. It can't be both. And then there's this problem of how easily can you really reindustrialize the United States? It's very hard to find any example of a developed economy that has gone back from services to manufacturing jobs after a certain level of per capita gross domestic product has been reached. In a way, President Trump wants to turn the clock of economic history back. Maybe it's to the 1950s, perhaps it's all the way to the 1890s. After all, William McKinley is supposed to be his favorite president. But this is going to be hard to do because, as anybody who tries to build manufacturing plant in America will tell you, well, whether there are tariffs or not is not the biggest issue. The issue is, can you get the permitting done?
Right.
Do you have the skilled labor that you need? So even in red states where this stuff is supposed to be easy, it turns out that there are lots of obstacles. Building fabs to do semiconductors in Arizona ought to be easy. But as the Wall Street Journal reported last year, it turns out to be easier to do that in Japan, just in terms of the speed with which you can get stuff done.
You run a consulting firm called Green Mantle, where you advise institutional investors, hedge fund managers, on the kind of the historical perspective of what's going on. What are you telling them, and what would you tell us as investors?
Well, our message, which is always historically informed, is that it's harder than it looks to turn back economic history, and you should expect there to be a meaningful cost in terms of prices, in terms also of employment. A lot of small and medium-sized businesses do not have the capacity to go to the Oval Office and say, please, can we have a carve out? You can do that if you're Tim Cook and you're running Apple, but all those small businesses that rely on China, say for toys or for apparel, they're really getting caught in a very heavy crossfire here. And we should expect there to be pain, and that pain will take months to manifest itself. The second thing is the US-China relationship is the crux of the matter. We are in a game of chicken between the two biggest economies in the world. And it's a far more aggressive game than we saw in the first Trump term. This is different because President Trump has upped the ante. He feels emboldened. He feels vindicated by his re-election. He is far more self-confident than the President Trump of 8 years ago. And therefore, you should expect this to be a much more dramatic negotiation. Now, the final thing, and a very important one, is, remember, this administration is interested not just in tariffs, it is interested in a weaker dollar. It's very unusual for a Treasury Secretary, for a US administration to say that it kind of wants the dollar to be weaker. That violates Bob Rubin's old rule that when asked about the dollar, the Treasury Secretary should say the policy of the United States government is a strong dollar. And only that. So we're in a new terrain here where the administration seems to want a weaker dollar to boost the competitiveness of US exports. I'd say buckle up, because it's a lot harder than it sounds to achieve the kind of depreciation of the currency that some members of the administration talk about.
Talk to us a little bit more about that. What policies that this administration is following that are weakening the dollar, and why that should worry us as Americans and as investors.
Well, Consuelo, you've got to get a bit nerdy here. You have to look at the effective exchange rate adjusted for trade. You want to know how the dollar stacks up against the currencies of our major trading partners. And if you do that kind of calculation, looking at real effective exchange rates, you see that the dollar has been quite strong. It strengthened in a pretty sustained way after the global financial crisis. And therefore, we may be due one of those periods when the dollar gets weak again, as happened in the mid-1980s, for example, and as happened in the early 1970s. But that can be good in the 1980s. We had a weaker dollar of 85 to 87. We also had lower interest rates because Paul Volcker he'd managed to deal with inflation, and markets boomed. But in the early 70s, it was a completely different story, because in the early 70s, the dollar was taken off its remaining link to gold. This was Richard Nixon's big shock. Tariffs were imposed. But guess what? Rates did not come down. Inflation pressures grew. Stagflation started to become a reality. And the stock market performed pretty dismally.
Oh, terribly.
So this is, from my vantage point, the most important question. Is it somehow going to be a rerun of the mid-1980s? In other words, is Donald Trump going to be the Ronald Reagan of the 2020s? Or does he run the risk of Nixon's fate and ending up being a president associated with stagflation and horrible stock market performance? And no one, I think, can be 100% certain about which of these scenarios it is.
One investment for a long-term diversified portfolio, Neil, considering the picture that you have painted for us, is there one asset that we should all own to kind of get us through this tariff turmoil that has been created?
Well, for some time, we've told our clients that you should probably want to own European defense stocks, because if one thing's clear, the United States is not going to be ponying up as much for European security as in the past. I think President Trump and Vice President Vance made that pretty clear since they re-entered the White House. And the Europeans have committed themselves to large-scale spending at the German national level, at the European level. There's big spending coming, and it's clear, given the threat that Russia has posed over the last 3 years since the invasion of Ukraine, that Europe is going to have to spend much more on defense. It's going to have to modernize its defense capabilities, and that has already proved positive for European defense companies, and I don't think that story is over.
Neil Ferguson, this is the first of a two-part interview, so thank you so much for joining us this week on Wealth Track, and I look forward to speaking to you very soon. So thank you, Neil, and talk to you soon.
My pleasure.
At the close of every Wealth Track, we try to give you one suggestion to help you build and protect your wealth over the long term. This week's action point is read Neil Ferguson's Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe, a particularly important read for current times as we deal with tariff shocks and the 5th anniversary of the onset of the COVID virus. Ferguson discusses how disasters, earthquakes, wildfires, financial crises, wars, and yes, pandemics are inherently hard to predict. He argues that historical perspective shows we are getting worse, not better, at handling these crises. The New York Times Book Review characterized Doom as insightful, productively provocative, and downright brilliant, which promises to make a contribution to improving our management of future disasters. Well, it certainly expands the reader's understanding of them, and it also puts COVID-19 and the various ways it was handled around the world into perspective. Let's hope we are not in the process of creating another catastrophe. Next week, in part 2 of our wide-ranging interview with Neil Ferguson, we explore the challenges to the old world order of U.S. military and economic dominance and what it could mean for U.S. investments. Please follow us on Facebook, X, and our YouTube channel. Thanks for watching. Have a super weekend and make the week ahead a healthy, profitable, and productive one.